Rowan Ford was a 9-year-old girl living in the small town of Stella, Missouri, who was born on April 11th, 1998. The town she was raised in was regarded as a small, tightly knit community that for the most part seemed very safe. However, just because crime is a rarity in a particular location doesn't mean it can't happen at all. Rowan lived with her mother, Colleen, and her stepfather, David Spears, and she also had several siblings. Rowan was described as a bright, kind-hearted child who approached people with care and gentleness. She attended 4th grade at Triway Elementary School, where she was liked by pretty much everyone. Her teachers frequently told Rowan's parents that she always seemed to be happy and enthusiastic. Rowan's mother, Colleen, worked at a local Walmart. Colleen was extremely dedicated to her children, so in order to support them, she often accepted the less desirable shifts which went late into the night. Nevertheless, she always found time to spend with Rowan. The two just had an amazing bond with each other. As for Rowan's stepfather, David Spears, he was a construction worker. Most of his peers shared that David was a diligent worker. However, there was a catch. David's past was a bit shady, which led some people to describe the man as untrustworthy and irresponsible. So on those late night shifts where Colleen couldn't watch Rowan, David was in charge. That brings us to the night of November 2nd, 2007. Colleen headed out for work and left Rowan in the care of David. She trusted him to watch over her and make sure she was safe, and he did watch Rowan, but only for a little while. Around 10 p.m., David left Rowan all alone in order to hang out with a group of friends. Amongst the group was one man named Chris Collings. The group of men went around various places, drinking and chatting with each other, just having a good time. Or at least that's what David claimed. David had made sure Rowan was okay before he left, and knowing just how mature she was for a 9-year-old, he didn't think leaving her alone would be much of an issue. He couldn't have been more wrong. Colleen finished her shift sometime in the morning of the next day, November 3rd, and arrived home at about 9 a.m. As soon as she stepped foot inside, she sort of got a chill running down her spine. Her instincts were telling her that something was off. She called out for Rowan, but she received no response. In fact, there was no noise in the house at all. Colleen rushed room to room, and after not finding Rowan, she stepped outside and yelled out for her, but yet again, no response. When Colleen went into Rowan's bedroom, she noticed that her bed was totally neat, almost as if she never even slept in it the previous night. Colleen came to terms with the fact that Rowan was missing. Desperate to find her, Colleen contacted David Spears. When David got to the house, his jaw dropped as he exclaimed that he had no idea what happened. The two contacted authorities, and when they questioned the two, they picked up on a particularly interesting detail. On the surface, David appeared to be worried about Rowan's whereabouts, but police thought he was being a bit suspicious. David told investigators that he had been out drinking with friends the previous night, but when police asked real specific questions about where he was, David struggled to answer them with a clear answer. Law enforcement quickly launched an investigation, treating the case as a possible abduction. When news of this spread across Stella, almost the entire community got up to help out. Tons of people volunteered to help search, while others assisted by distributing flyers and finishing other tasks. The initial investigation focused on piecing together the events of the previous night. David gave police a list of names of the people he was hanging out with, and amongst them was Chris Collings. Investigators questioned all of these friends and acquaintances of David's, but it took several days. The investigation quickly intensified as law enforcement was starting to utilize helicopters, search dogs, and additional search teams. And it was because of the growing intensity that someone finally caved and admitted that they weren't telling the whole truth. This someone being Chris Collings. While Chris was being questioned, police were still interviewing David as well. They picked up on David's increasing evasiveness when it came to answering seemingly simple questions. David claimed that he had left Rowan alone to spend time with friends, but his timeline and details were vague and often contradictory. This raised suspicions, which led to police digging deeper into him and his friends. Under intense questioning, Chris Collings' story began to fall apart, and he confessed to his involvement in Rowan's disappearance. He started going into the disturbing details about Rowan's abduction from her home, and the events that followed are just really disgusting. Like, this guy is the scum of the earth. Chris Collings admitted to taking Rowan to an abandoned farmhouse in McDonald County, Missouri. There, he and strangled her before disposing of her body in a nearby sinkhole. Chris took authorities to this location on November 9th, and indeed, they found Rowan's remains. The location was remote and difficult to access. It was partially hidden by dense foliage and debris. David Spears was also implicated in the crime through circumstantial evidence and Chris's statements. The investigation revealed that David had not only failed to protect Rowan, but had potentially been complacent in the events leading to her death. Both men were arrested, and between the two, they received charges such as first-degree murder and kidnapping. As a result for pleading guilty, David received a reduced charge of endangering the welfare of a child and hindering prosecution. He got an 11-year prison sentence in 2012. His initial sentencing was looking to be more like a life sentence with no parole. One attorney was quoted saying, "There was no physical evidence that would have supported convicting David Spears." As for Chris, he received the death penalty, which I believe was last updated in April of this year, where an execution date was requested. This next entry focuses on two people, the first of which was named Dmitry Bakshiv and the second Natalia Baksheva. Dmitry Bakshiv was born in 1982 and had a difficult childhood plagued by instability and criminal behavior. He was given up to an orphanage by his birth parents after they decided that he was too much of a hassle on top of their already rough lifestyle. Dmitry was later adopted, but down the line his adoptive mother passed away, which sent Dmitry's adoptive father down a bad path. As a result of not really getting a proper upbringing, Dmitry involved himself in petty crimes such as robbery and car theft. He worked various jobs, including an apartment repairman and more. As you could imagine, with a rough childhood, Dmitry had several mental health issues. He lacked confidence, and his later diagnosis of tuberculosis just made his day-to-day life all the more taxing on his body and mind. And that brings us to the other half of this case, Natalia Baksheva. She was born in 1975 and worked as a nurse. She was regarded pretty highly amongst her peers, but due to her unhealthy relationship with alcohol, she was eventually fired. Later interviews of her acquaintances and coworkers revealed that Natalia was more of a dominant personality, and in most cases, that's not that big of a deal. However, Natalia crossed a line where her dominant personality also made her more manipulative and controlling. Pair someone like this with a more self-conscious man like Dmitry, the dominant one can get the other to do a lot of messed up stuff. Similar to Dmitry, Natalia also lost her mother at a young age, but she was fortunate enough to still have a loving family that kept her on the right path. Later on in life, she had a child with a man in the military where she was also working at. Unfortunately, her husband passed away, and this is what started Natalia on her path of chronic alcoholism. In order to cope with her pain, she resorted to consuming exuberant amounts of liquor and, on occasion, illegal substances. Dmitry and Natalia first met in 1999 and later got married and moved in together. At some point in the relationship, Natalia's son had moved out, and there isn't too much information out there about him. In fact, his identity is unknown, which is probably a good thing. Fast forward to September 2017, construction workers in Krasnodar, Russia found a lost cell phone. The curiosity of the construction workers got the best of them, and they decided to start going through it. And when they opened the photos, their faces just froze in place. They were looking at a man posing with human body parts. This man, unbeknownst to them, was Dmitry Bakshiv. The workers were hoping that these were just like movie props or something, but it just looked far too realistic. One of the images even depicted Dmitry holding onto some parts with his mouth. The construction workers agreed that they shouldn't look anymore and contacted police about their discovery, which kicked off the investigation into Dmitry and Natalia. These guys were only caught by accident. Following the discovery, authorities traced the phone back to Dmitry and Natalia. They were living in a dormitory at a military academy where Natalia had previously worked as a nurse. They arrived at the dormitory one day and informed the couple that they would need to search their residence. Obviously, the couple didn't want this, but it's not like there was much they could do. The police conducted a raid on their residence and they found a lot of fucked up shit. There were jars containing organs, frozen parts, and other slabs of meat that were left in such a way that investigators believed that they were being consumed. The couple's living space was also described as being a complete mess. There was trash everywhere, which emitted a foul odor that filled every inch of the residence. There were also wigs strewn about, which made some believe that Dmitry and Natalia liked to play around with the remains. Amongst the remains, investigators were able to confirm the identity of a woman named Elena Vashrushiva. She was working as a waitress prior to her run-in with Dmitry and Natalia. It stated that one day Elena and Dmitry had encountered each other in a restaurant, and Natalia felt that Elena was flirting with Dmitry. Dmitry harbored no ill will toward Elena, but Natalia was able to coerce him into killing her. Sometime in 2017, Dmitry invited Elena out for some drinks, and during this meeting, he stabbed Elena to death. Dmitry contacted Natalia, telling her that the task was done. The two went on to take apart Elena and take several selfies with her remains. They took some of her back to their residence to be cooked and consumed. Other times, Dmitry or Natalia would sneak some sort of substance into a food or drink their victim was having to incapacitate them before taking their life. And as I have said before, the remains were stored in their fridge, freezer, cellar, and even in jars filled with saline solution. Initially, Dmitry actually tried to lie and say that these remains were just things that he stumbled upon accidentally while out on walks. However, he did later confess to being responsible for actually taking the life of Elena, but he made sure to say that it was under the influence and manipulation of Natalia. Natalia was implicated as the mastermind behind all of these crimes. Investigators later observed that Dmitry would quite literally follow Natalia's directions without a split second of doubt. In February of 2019, she was convicted of incitement to murder and received 10 years in a penal colony, which is basically a settlement used to exile criminals. She also got a 1.5-year sentence in prison. Natalia attempted to appeal this sentencing but failed, and quite a few of my resources were translated, so certain parts may have been lost in translation, but it seems that only Elena's murder was actually used in court to convict the duo. As for Dmitry, he was sentenced in June of the same year. The court sort of let Dmitry off easy, stating that while he was the main perpetrator, he was being manipulated by Natalia. Ultimately, he received a 12-year and 2-month sentence in a max security prison. Furthermore, he had to participate in treatment for his mental health issues. However, he would end up dying in 2020 due to untreated type 1 diabetes. It was said that he had diabetes long before he and Natalia were arrested. Due to the graphic nature of the case, the story of it saw immense media attention. This led to a lot of speculation and rumors, such as one suggesting that the couple had been killing people since the late 90s when they initially met. For this next case, we'll be visiting the state of Kansas, specifically Valley Center, a city in Sedgwick County with a current population of about 7,300. In Valley Center was a couple named Melissa and Roger Bluml. They adopted a boy named Anthony when he was a toddler. Anthony was also often referred to as Tony, which is also what I'm going to be calling him for the rest of this case. They also adopted another toddler named Chris. Melissa and Roger were overjoyed at being able to raise 2 kids. They had big plans and dreams of providing a loving home and being able to watch them grow and become wonderful adults. Tony's early life with the Blumls appeared totally normal, but as he grew older, significant behavioral issues began to surface, especially during his teenage years. By the time Tony reached high school, he was struggling with a lot of issues. He began smoking a lot of marijuana, which became a frequent cause of arguments within the household. The Blumls were the type that expected their kids to abide by a set of rules and curfews, but Tony proved to be quite resistant towards them. When Tony became a senior in high school, his rambunctious behavior escalated. At this point, he just wouldn't listen to a single thing his parents said and continued his substance use right in front of them just to spite them. Every encounter in every day was almost like a war between Tony and his parents. One incident that marked a significant turning point was Tony's arrest for driving under the influence. At the time, Tony had plans of joining the military, specifically the Air Force, so as a result of the DUI, his hopes of doing so were shattered. The Blumls obviously still cared about Tony, and all of their arguments were just coming from a loving place. But after years of rebellious behavior, they came to terms that they needed to be more extreme with someone such as Tony. They believed that he needed to face the consequences of his actions in order to learn and grow, and hopefully these lessons would be enough to set him on the right path. So one day, the Blumls decided to ask Tony to leave their home. This decision was not made lightly, but the combination of Tony's defiance defiance, substance use, and legal issues left them with limited options. They hoped that this tough love approach would encourage Tony to take responsibility for his life and perhaps reconsider his choices. However, instead of improving the situation, Tony's resentment towards his adoptive parents just got worse. Now he felt that he was being abandoned and betrayed. This resentment festered and evolved into genuine hate. Afterwards, Tony started to do some research on his biological parents and eventually reconnected with his mother, Keisha Schauberg. Tony was hoping to find what he desired from the Blumls in Keisha, and he sort of got what he wished for, but it's not what he needed. Tony decided to visit Keisha in California, but he brought along a friend named Braden Smith. The visit was meant to be a fresh start for Tony, away from the strict environment of his adoptive home. The two stayed with Keisha in her small apartment, which she shared with her girlfriend Sean Hamilton and her 7-year-old daughter. The apartment was barely enough for two, so when Tony and Braden showed up, it was even more cramped and the general environment was just less than ideal. You see, Keisha also had a very unhealthy relationship with a copious amount of substances. So the trio of Tony, Keisha, and Braden spent almost every day just consuming substances and bonding over their shared hatred towards the Blumls. Tony said that he felt as though they favored his younger brother Chris and as a result restricted his own freedom. He believed that they were way too strict and did not allow him to live the life that he wanted. Turned out that Keisha had wanted to visit her children several times, but was denied due to her unhealthy habits. Now, I'm not entirely sure if it was the Blumls themselves denying Keisha or if it was some sort of child services group that was keeping Keisha away. But regardless, Keisha grew a distaste towards Melissa and Roger. Realizing that the two had mutual enemies, Keisha and Tony started to get some ideas. Tony conspired with Keisha, Braden, and another man named Andrew Ellington to murder Melissa and Roger, the primary motive being financial gain. Tony believed that by eliminating his adoptive parents, he could collect a substantial amount of money from life insurance policies and inherit their assets. Braden was promised a split of the money in return for his connections. Braden was able to get the group firearms and various resources required for such an event. As for Andrew, he was another friend of Tony and Braden's who had ridiculous dreams of one day becoming a hitman. The group got to planning out how they would approach the Blumls and how they would actually go through with the act of violence in order to maximize their payouts. Tony chose November 15th, 2013 as the date for the murders, knowing that his brother Chris would be away at a wrestling meet that day, ensuring no other family members would be around to stop them. On the chosen night, Tony took Melissa and Roger out to dinner. Tony was faking the entire thing as a sort of apology for his terrible behavior. Melissa and Roger, being the kind-hearted people that they were, wanted to see the best in others, so they let their guard down and accepted Tony. This also, in turn, provided an alibi for Tony while the attack was set up and carried out. While Tony was at dinner with his parents, Keisha and Andrew broke into the Bluml home. They staged the house to look like a robbery gone wrong by ransacking it and taking valuables. The idea was to mislead the police into believing the murders were a result of a home invasion. Once Tony, Melissa, and Roger finished their dinner and had a conversation, they drove back to the Bluml residence. When they arrived and got out of the car, Keisha and Andrew ambushed them. Melissa immediately recognized Keisha, but unfortunately was taken out before she could actually do anything. In later reports from interviews, it was stated that Melissa said, "Oh my gosh, Keisha," during the ambush. After taking out Melissa, Keisha adjusted her firearm towards Roger, however, it jammed. But ultimately, Roger would still be struck in his head. After the shooting had occurred, the group fled and Chris Bluml returned home after his wrestling meet. When he saw his parents lying in pools of blood, he sprinted off calling for help. Medical officials arrived and transported the two to the hospital. The couple was in critical condition and the next day, November 16th, Melissa would pass away from her wounds. As for Roger, he actually survived for about a month before also succumbing to his injuries. He passed away on December 21st. During the initial investigation, Tony was pretty promptly suspected of being responsible. There were numerous moments where he exhibited suspicious behavior. For example, when Tony visited his parents in the hospital, he showed little to no emotion, and the very first thing he asked about was the inheritance. Authorities also quickly learned that Tony did not like Melissa or Roger. Even Chris told them that Tony and their parents never got along, so if he had to guess who was responsible, he would actually pick Tony. So authorities shifted their focus towards Tony and considered him their primary suspect. Investigators did some digging into Tony's circle of friends and stumbled upon Braden Smith. They brought him in for some questioning and he pretty easily confessed. Braden completely exposed Tony and Keisha's plan, telling investigators that Tony promised not only him, but another person named Andrew Ellington a split of the inheritance money. Police then brought in Andrew, who confirmed all of what Braden shared and even identified Keisha as the shooter. Furthermore, cell phone records showed that the group was frequently contacting each other leading up to the event. These phone calls would later be very important as it was evidence towards conspiracy. As for the firearms used, they were disposed of in a small body of water, which Braden showed to police. Following the investigation, Tony, Keisha, Braden, and Andrew were all apprehended and faced charges for first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and aggravated burglary. Tony and Keisha both received life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. Braden and Andrew received life sentences with the possibility of parole after X amount of years had passed.